Welcome, everybody. My name is Rose Myron, and I am the director of the Darcy McNichol Center for American Indian and Indigenous Studies at the Newberry Library. Thank you for joining us for today's program, Black Freedom on Native Land with Alaina Roberts. The Newberry Library supports and inspires research, teaching, and learning in the humanities. Since our founding in 1887, the Newberry has remained dedicated to deepening our collective understanding of ourselves and the world around us. We connect researchers and visitors with our collection in the Newberry's reading rooms, exhibition galleries, program spaces, classrooms, and online digital resources. The Newberry has recently reopened our doors to readers and visitors. You can visit our website, newberry.org, to make an appointment to do research in the reading rooms, or you can stop by the library without an appointment Tuesday through Saturday to visit our exhibition halls. Our Rosenberg Bookshop is open Wednesday through Saturday. You can visit the website digital.newberry.org/libertad to learn about our current exhibition and public program series called Viva la Libertad, about the age of revolutions across the Americas in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The exhibition will be open until July 24th. Today's program is one example of the Newberry Library's civic commitment to public engagement and an intellectual engagement, bringing together communities of scholars, students, and the public to discuss ideas that matter in our world today is central to the Newberry's mission. We are also committed to contributing to a better understanding of history in order to promote equity and cross-cultural understanding. It is with that obligation that we would like to begin today's program with a statement about the Newberry's history and the land on which the city of Chicago resides. Located near the confluence of several waterways, the Newberry Library sits on land that intersects with the Aboriginal homelands of several tribal nations: the Council of the Three Fires, the Potawatomi, Odawa, and Ojibwe nations, the Illinois Confederacy, the Peoria and Kaskaskia nations, and the Miamia, Wea, Pakiwaki, and Meskwaki nations. The Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Kickapoo, and Mascoutin nations also call the region of Northeast Illinois home. Indigenous peoples continue to live in this area and celebrate their traditional teachings and lifeways. Today, Chicago is home to one of the largest urban Indigenous communities in the United States, and this land remains an important place for Indigenous peoples. As a Chicago institution, it is the Newberry's responsibility to acknowledge this historical context and build reciprocal relationships with the tribal nations on whose lands we are situated. During the program, you'll have the opportunity to enter questions into the Q&A feature on Zoom or in the comment section if you are joining us on Facebook or YouTube. As time permits, our speakers will respond to your questions. And now it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Elena E. Roberts is an assistant professor of history at the University of Pittsburgh. Her research focuses on the intersection of African American and Native American history from the 19th century to the modern day, with particular attention to identity, settler colonialism, and anti-Blackness. In addition to I've Been Here All the While, Black Freedom on Native Land, which was published by the University of Pennsylvania Press in 2021, her writing has appeared in the Washington Post, the Journal of Civil War Era, and the Western Historic Quarterly. And at this point, I will hand things over to Dr. Roberts.
Hello, I'm so happy to be here virtually to share my new book with you all. Thank you to Dr. Miron, as well as Elizabeth Cummings, who ran the planning for this program like a well-oiled machine. So I will introduce myself by saying that all of the research I do as a historian and a professor is connected to my family. Like most people who identify themselves as African American, I come from people who were enslaved for generations. But on my father's side, my ancestors were not owned by white people. They were owned by Native Americans. In the 1830s, they, along with their Chickasaw and Choctaw Indian owners, embarked on a journey that we know today as the Trail of Tears, making their way to Oklahoma, which was then known as Indian Territory. During the Civil War, their owners fought for the Confederacy, and when the Confederacy lost, the United States government forced my family's owners, along with other Native American slave owners, to free their slaves and provide them with land. And so in about a minute, I've just reframed how most people think about slavery, Indian removal, the Civil War, and Reconstruction. All of these events that are so important to this country's history were different for my family because they lived within Indian nations, not within the United States. And retelling and reshaping these histories is the core of my book, I've Been Here All the While. Now, one of the key themes of my book is what it means that Native Americans adopted slavery in the first place, taking on ideas about race and Black inferiority that we usually only associate with white people. And another theme is how after emancipation, Some African Americans took on negative and harmful stereotypes about Native Americans as they migrated to the West. So this evening, I'm going to give you an overview of this history and talk to you about how I think acknowledging some of the negative interactions between Black and Native people in our past is necessary for us to work together as allies today. So let's start with how Native Americans began to own Black people as slaves. In the late 1700s and early 1800s, white American politicians and reformers encouraged Native Americans, particularly those in the East and Southeast, to adapt aspects of Euro-American culture, such as language, clothing, and political structures, arguing that this would civilize them. This may be familiar to some of you. For example, Henry Knox, the Secretary of War under President George Washington, advocated what we call the civilization policy, because he believed that if Indians were more like whites, they would be more willing to give up a majority of their land. Then in his kind of ideal world, Indians would then use their reduced landholdings like white Americans, engaging in agriculture and private land use and disavowing their tradition of communal land ownership. As chattel slavery became increasingly integral to white American society, white Americans also encouraged Native people to become slaveholders because, of course, slaveholders were considered really the height of economic success. So within this period, all Indian tribes took on various facets of American culture that suited them and ignored those that didn't suit them. For example, Christian religion and American gender roles were two things that most people in the Chickasaw Nation, the nation in which several members owned members of my family, they didn't embrace those until arguably the early 20th century. And so Native people in this time period are picking and choosing what they're interested in and what they care about. But many of the wealthiest, most influential members of 5 Indian nations did begin to buy enslaved Black people like my family members. And these are these 5 tribes: the Chickasaws, Choctaws, Creeks, Seminoles, and Cherokees. And you've probably heard of these tribes. They've especially been in the news lately because of their COVID-19 vaccination efforts. And so in addition to slavery, these 5 tribes also do things like create newspapers in the model of European and American newspapers, create a tripartite government structure similar to that of the United States, although these are 2 things that are working really alongside each other: Native modes of governance as well as American modes of governance. And for this reason, because these 5 tribes choose to assimilate in various ways, white Americans began calling them 5 civilized tribes, which Americans now shorten to 5 tribes because, of course, 5 civilized tribes is very problematic. Now, along with the slave owning development in these tribes comes with the idea that people of African descent are inferior. And while, just like in the United States, the majority of people in these nations didn't own slaves, the Indian elites who did created a culture and an economy that highly valued and regulated slavery and the rights of slave owners. Then, in the 1830s, an event, or really a process, changed the life of all of these slaveholding tribes, as well as the Black people who lived among them, and that's Indian removal. And so since contact, the British had struggled to really reconcile the fact that they wanted Native American land with the reality that they didn't have the manpower or the resources to just take it by force. And so they made treaties and agreements with Native people for parcels of land or for control of various regions. Now, in the colonial period, Native peoples and Europeans negotiated this settlement on relatively equal grounds, often with Native people actually having more power and influence in these relationships, but they were using both treaties and political measures as well as war and violence. But after the Revolutionary War, coercive white encroachment on Native Americans' land steadily increased as settlers sought resources and homesteads and moved farther west. As plantation-style slavery spread through the 19th century, the 5 tribes found their lush, agriculturally rich southeastern homes under attack. White settlers began illegally squatting on their land, and state governments followed their lead by sanctioning this trespassing and trying to extend their state laws over Native Americans and their lands. And so this was all part of an effort to either force Indians to move west of the Mississippi River, as Americans have been trying to get them to do since really the beginning of the country, or to force them to submit and just allow whites to take their land. Now, Native American people fought against this, sometimes militarily through war or conflict, but also through law, which is what they were told to do, which is what they were told civilized people did: use the law. But all of these were ultimately unsuccessful for the majority of Native people, especially in these 5 tribes. And so, as you probably know, this is going on through the 1820s, but in 1830, the federal government with President Andrew Jackson at its head shows its support for what these white settlers and white Southerners are doing by advocating for and signing the Indian Removal Act. Now, for good reason, Indian removal is considered for many tribes to be really a foundational journey, a journey that solidified their resilience as a people. But what I want you to take from this talk is that Indian removal, the Trail of Tears, did that same thing for many of the enslaved people who endured alongside their owners in the 5 tribes. And so those people of African descent remembered removal as really a trauma that solidified their membership in these tribes and their shared history with these tribes. So there are really 2 different ways that Black and Native history intersect in what I've kind of just given you. And that's first, that Indian removal is necessary for the expansion of plantation slavery, and second, that Indian removal itself involved people of African descent. Now, as for these tribes rebuilding after removal, many historians would argue that actually they rebuild better than before. And so they, of course, create government buildings, homes, plantations, and there are many people who are very economically successful once they make it to, again, what is then known as Indian territory. But about 30 years pass, and the United States is increasingly divided over slavery. Soon, we have the Civil War. And as nations where important and influential families owned enslaved Black women and men, the 5 tribes were very interested in these discussions occurring in the United States about Black humanity, Black rights, the Civil War, the expansion of slavery. All these things that we think about as key to this country were also very important in the 5 tribes. In some tribes, especially the Cherokee and Creek nations, there were large factional disputes over the institution of slavery and over joining in the war. Now, as the Confederacy is kind of building alliances, in an effort to recruit them, the Confederacy talks to the 5 tribes using an agent who was very familiar with members of these tribes. And they really tell them what they want to hear. And they argue that they will give them what the United States, with the Union, has not been giving them. And so they say they would allow them to have more of a say in governmental affairs. They would allow them to have congressional representation. They would allow them to keep their land in Indian territory forever without white settlement. They would be more reliable at paying them their money for their homelands that they had sold to the US government. And most importantly, for some of these elites, they would allow them to keep slavery, while the Union, after 1863, would, of course, have not. Now, would the Confederacy actually have kept these promises? Probably not. After all, the Confederacy was partially composed of the states that had just forced the 5 tribes out of their homelands around 30 years earlier. But still, these treaties were enticing to members of the 5 tribes. So you have a shared ideology around slavery that some members of the 5 tribes have and think is very important. But then you also have geography. And so the Indian territory, especially where these 5 tribes are located, is very close to Texas, Arkansas, many of these kind of Confederate strongholds in the more western part of the country at this time. So it's important that they have some sort of protection. And so there are practical aspects of these alliances as well as kind of sentiment, shared sentiment around slavery. And so as we go into the war, all of the 5 tribes are split. Members of all of these tribes fight for the Union, fight for the Confederacy, and others are refugees who actually leave Indian territory hoping to avoid fighting or having to choose battles. Around 14 battles are fought in and around Indian territory. Just like in the United States, a number of enslaved Black men leave to fight for the Union or stay and are forced to work for their Confederate owners, doing physical labor predominantly. And when the war is over, the United States ignores the fact that some tribal members had fought for the Union. They ignore the fact that they had not sent the 5 tribes any protection. They wouldn't even give them extra munitions. Instead, the United States uses the fact that some tribal members had fought for the Confederacy against them. And so the US points to the 5 tribes' affiliations with the Confederacy as behavior supposedly deserving of punishment, deserving of distrust. And they claim that because they made an alliance and treaties with the Confederacy, that the United States no longer has valid treaties with them. And so they threaten to withhold money that they desperately need after a war unless they sign new treaties. And they do, because they've been coerced into it. So these treaties are called the Treaties of 1866. They serve as the five tribes' official surrender, as well as their Reconstruction documents. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So one of the most extreme items in these treaties is the cession of land. So the five tribes are forced to give up a majority of the land that they had really just moved on only around 30 years earlier. The other three big items in these treaties relevant to our discussion today were that the five tribes had to emancipate the enslaved people in their nations, they had to adopt them as citizens, and they had to give them land. And the Chickasaw and Choctaw nations had to give them specifically 40 acres of land. Now, if you're at all familiar with Reconstruction or really Black history in general, then you know how significant that 40 acres is, because African Americans in the US fought for that and they didn't get it. And so this is the United States coming into another nation, Indian nations, that are supposed to have the right to create their own laws, run their own nation, be completely sovereign in just about every other way. And the US is saying, we're going to force you to free enslaved people, something we ourselves could not do without a war. We're going to force you to adopt these people as citizens and give them all the accompanying rights of citizenship, something we ourselves in 1866 have not yet done. And we're going to force you to give them land. Now, was this right? Legally, no. Now, the Cherokee Nation had ordered emancipation in 1863. So they were the only one of the five tribes who decided to do this without direct coercion. But all the others, the Creeks, the Seminoles, the Chickasaws, the Choctaws, would they have ever emancipated enslaved people without American intervention? We don't know. After emancipation, would they have given their former slaves rights and citizenship? Probably not. Would they have given them land? Probably not. But this freedom, these rights, and especially this land, put the former slaves of the five tribes on a different plane than African Americans in the United States. It gave them different opportunities. These opportunities are why so many Black people from the US flocked there after emancipation. It's why Oklahoma has so many Black towns and why it had Black Wall Street, which of course, the anniversary of the Tulsa Massacre just passed. More people are far more aware of Black Wall Street and its existence. And so this moment in Reconstruction Indian Territory history is really one of those interesting historical moments where my identities as both a historian and a descendant of former slaves of Chickasaws and Choctaws, which I call free people, comes into play, because I have to recognize something as legally wrong as US intervention in a foreign nation, or as Indian nations were known after the Cherokee Nation v. Georgia Supreme Court case, domestic dependent nations. But I also have to recognize that people like my family might never have been freed if not for these technically legally unjust actions on the part of the United States. Now, I'm going to use that term for former slaves again and again, probably in this presentation, so I just wanted to run over those real quick. So Indian free people is a general term that I use in my work to refer to any former slave of any of the five tribes. And then, of course, more specifically, Chickasaw freed people, Chickasaw free women, and freed men refer to specifically the former slaves of Chickasaw Indians. And so the reason that the land designated for Indian freed people in these treaties, the treaties of 1866, is different and is historically significant is because this was Black land receipt through American governmental action. Congressional Republicans had not been able to agree on giving African Americans in the United States land. It was frankly impossible for the majority of Republicans who were moderates to imagine taking land from a white person and giving it to a Black person. As I'm sure you know, property ownership was and continues to be one of the most revered American values. But Republicans such as the Secretary of the Interior and Commissioner of Indian Affairs at the time could imagine giving Indian land to people of African descent. Because in these men's opinion, the five tribes didn't value land because they didn't value private land ownership in the same way that white Americans did. And so they saw Indians' use of land as uncivilized. They saw them as not properly utilizing their land. Therefore, to them, giving Indian land away to people of African descent fulfilled this kind of lofty, idealistic Republican goal of Black land ownership while still allowing whites in the United States to maintain their land. And so here is the United States using this idea of Indian savagery against the five tribes, who, as I told you earlier, used to be considered civilized. different from other Native people. But now that that is no longer politically useful, the five tribes are once again uncivilized. And this change allows Black people to take ownership of land in Indian territory. And Indian free people of the five tribes played into this. So I want to show you a Chickasaw freedman named Blaine Holman and the way he talked about his former owners. So he says, at that time, the Indians did not have anything but small farms. And of course, the freedmen were reared among them, so they didn't work like they should, but just raised enough corn to make their bread. And so this may seem, maybe this isn't that bad, but the language that he uses, they didn't work like they should. So he's using the idea of Americanness as being enterprising, as creating wealth. But in his opinion, Native Americans were only looking to survive. And so really he's saying that with American tutelage, Indian free people were capable of working harder the way they should if they were only given the model and the opportunity. And so this is strategic language use. Indian free people were very aware that it was the United States that had negotiated for their freedom and for their land ownership, not their native former slave owners. And so some of them aligned themselves with white Americans and their definitions of civilization and productivity. And as more Black people look to move west, we see some of them also using these ideas about Native American laziness or lack of productivity or civilization. In fact, one of the most famous African American leaders of the 19th century and really of all time, Frederick Douglass, gave several speeches where he spoke about how African Americans might find land and peace in the West and how the United States should support this endeavor financially. But to support this appeal, Douglass denigrated Native Americans. So in a speech to the American Anti-Slavery Society in 1869, Douglass said this: "The Negro is more like the white man than the Indian in his tastes and tendencies and disposition to accept civilization. The Indian rejects our civilization. It is not so with the Negro. He loves you and remains with you under all circumstances, in slavery and in freedom." Now here we can see a clear dichotomy being made between African Americans and white Americans on one hand, and Native Americans on the other hand. And of course, the Native Americans are on the bad side, the uncivilized side. Now he's really joining African Americans' goals and behavior with white people's by using our civilization. In another earlier speech titled "Land for the Landless," Douglass said this: "The peopling of the national domain with an enterprising, intelligent, and hardy race of immigrants, transforming the savage wilderness into flourishing civilized communities, multiplying new states, and adding immensely to the wealth and productive industry of the nation, would extend the area of freedom and would increase the political power of the North and West, the power of the people, would dangerously menace the perpetuity of the institution of slavery and the democratic slaveholding aristocracy built upon it." And so these sound like good things, right? Of course, we want to increase freedom. We want to limit the power of the democratic slaveholding aristocracy. But to say these things, what is Douglass doing? Again, he's putting down Native people who, in his words here, have not utilized the West. And so Douglass, of course, is an educated man. He is familiar with Native Americans and with Native reformers. He knew this land was not free and that it had not always been part of the national domain, but rather it had been taken from Indian hands. Douglass also knew that its swell of American immigration to the region would change and worsen circumstances for Native people. Yet, here he is using the language of savagery and civilization to juxtapose what the region was allegedly like in Indian hands, bad, and what it might be like after an interracial American immigration of whites and Blacks, good. Now, while Douglass's two speeches are given around 4 years apart, I think they represent a sustained belief on the part of one of our most famous Black radicals that African Americans deserve to share in the settler colonial spoils of the Native West. And so what my book's argument really boils down to is that my identity in these kind of two different worlds, that of Indian freed people and African Americans in the United States, allowed me to see the past these categories that we traditionally put Native and Black people into. And so we might see them as victims or as people who had horrific events occur in their lives and fought back against them and were resilient. And so we celebrate their triumphs. And of course, I understand why. But when we're confronted with the complexities of their actions and the ways in which their words affected others, are we willing to see Black and Native people in a different way? Can we accept the fact that people who suffered so much from settler colonialism as dispossessed peoples, as forced laborers, as forced reproducers of mixed race children, can we accept that these same people could also act in a capacity that served the colonial state at times? They're difficult questions, but I do look forward to hearing your thoughts about them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elena. That was fascinating. I feel like I already learned so much, and I'm excited to talk with you more about this topic in your book. I want to pick up on what you were just saying about Frederick Douglass and start there. Could you tell us a little bit about what the reaction to Douglass's words were from African Americans in the United States? Did they listen to the entreaties of leaders like Douglass and migrate west?
Yes, so Douglass, there are plenty of Black leaders who pop up who are either already existing in roles like a church pastor, as well as like a politician after the Civil War. But then there are also people who become speculators and who sometimes work with white Americans to create Black towns. And so there are lots of African Americans who want to take advantage of what they see as an opportunity to kind of cash in on the land allotments that Black people are getting in Indian territory. But also there are people who really appreciate the kinds of ideas that Frederick Douglass is espousing, that African Americans deserve to kind of not just settle in the West, but also have access to these ideas of democracy, freedom, everything that the United States supposedly stands for.
And then how did the 5 tribes and Indian freed people react to that migration?
Well, it's really interesting because there is lots of intermarriage between Indian freed people and African Americans. Of course, they see their experiences as very similar as former slaves, but there are also groups of Indian freed people who see African Americans as kind of messing up the good thing that they have. So, you know, they see this as a result of their enslavement, the fruit of their labor, as in a term. And when these more and more African Americans come, a lot of Native people get afraid, afraid that they will no longer be seen as Native, and that will affect kind of their political status as sovereign nations, afraid that these African Americans will kind of politically overrun them and become a bigger voting bloc than they are. And so the interactions that African Americans from the US have with Indian free people is really kind of enlightening, because we see different groups of people who have all kind of suffered at the hands of the United States coming together to try to defend what they see as theirs. And it's really all over this land in Indian territory.
I want to step back a little bit and ask you about the actual process of how Indian people received land allotments. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that exactly looked like and how Native nations reacted and how it affected them in that moment?
Yeah, so a big part of my book is talking about how land allotment is very positive for people of African descent, and also very negative for Native people. And that's kind of the predominant narrative that I think has existed with land allotment. And so land allotment happens with the Dawes Act. The Curtis Act specifically applies the Dawes Act to the 5 tribes. This is the late 1880s and early 1890s. And in the early 1890s, people actually begin receiving their land allotments. So formerly they were living on various parts of each Indian nation, and you could basically claim as much as you could build on, or as they called it, improve. So you could pick a place in any nation, build a house there, you know, build a fence there, and claim it as yours. The Dawes allotment process makes this more formal. And so you have a land allotment that is yours, and it goes into the traditional American way of owning property. And in this process, Native American nations are really trying to defend themselves, keep as much land as they can for their tribal citizens, and also really stop the United States from trying to absorb it into itself, in essence. And so land allotment really sets up Indian Territory to become the state of Oklahoma, which is unfortunately what happens. Although, of course, the Supreme Court decision, McGirt, established that these reservations still exist and never stopped existing, but it still reneges on the original promise made to the 5 tribes that there would never be any American settlement in Indian Territory at all.
So the next question I want to ask is just sort of about the relationship between Native and Black people during this time period and how that leads up today. And this actually ties into a question that somebody has asked us in the Q&A. So the question I want to ask you is, why did Native and Black people take on these problematic perspectives of each other? I want to hear more about sort of how that ties to colonialism. And this sort of ties to a question that somebody asked in the chat about assimilation. They're asking specifically about the use of the word choice, saying that Indigenous people sort of chose to assimilate into white norms rather than were coerced. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about how these problematic perspectives develop, what role colonialism plays in that, and maybe talk a little bit about to what extent these issues still exist today.
So I talk about the parts of assimilation I talk about, which are specifically usually related to anti-Blackness, as choices because the 5 tribes are the 5 tribes in part because they were slave owners, and there were members of other nations throughout North America who owned slaves or who participated in slavery in different ways. But these 5 nations did make a choice to protect slavery in terms of it really being kind of a part of capitalism, something that allowed them to accumulate wealth. And that's why they are still some of the wealthiest tribes in North America. But of course, there are many ways that Native people were, forced to change ways of culture, ways of disseminating that culture. There was just the discovery of, I feel horrible even talking about it, buried children at the residential school, which was also our history in the United States. And so there are, of course, many ways that Native people didn't have control over so much, but there are many ways, especially in kind of the 1700s and even early 1800s, that it was kind of a choice to decide, do you want to let missionaries into your nation or not? Do you want to send your children to a boarding school at that time? Because it was voluntary at that time. And so as we go on, and as the United States gains more military power and expands across North America, Native people have less and less of a choice. But I think it's important to differentiate this earlier period when they do and when those decisions are strategic in that they help them become seen in a specific way. Being seen as civilized allowed the 5 tribes to negotiate with the United States in a different way. The US, various tribal agents, the Secretary of Interior, all often thought of them in a different way. They were able to choose the land. The Chickasaws were able to essentially carry out their own removal and pay for it and kind of do it more in a way they would have liked, even though, of course, that's still coercion. Okay, so moving into how do we see that today? There are so many legacies of the adoption of slavery in the 5 tribes that reverberate predominantly in the way we think about citizenship. Who is an Indian? What does an Indian look like? What is the importance of shared history and kinship? And I think it's important to think of the adoption of anti-Blackness as a choice because it's still a choice. I mean, okay, so all of the 5 tribes have had issues with essentially throwing out the citizenship of their former slaves. And so the Cherokee Nation is currently the only of the 5 tribes to accept formally and legally their former slaves as citizens, even though all of these tribes promised to do so after the Civil War. But in the 70s, 1970s, and 1980s, all of the tribes disenfranchised these people. And they essentially claim, these people have no history with us. They're not Indian. They shouldn't be here. They're just taking resources that are ours. And it's kind of a segregationist narrative in a sense. And today, people like Black Seminoles, the descendants of Seminole free people, don't have full citizenship. So they actually have literally a second-class citizenship. And these are all remnants from ideas that these Native people chose to take on and adopt in the 1700s.
Thank you. It's certainly a complicated history that still has a lot of ramifications today, as you've talked about. So I have one last question for you, and then I want to open it up to audience Q&A. And we already have quite a few questions coming in on the chat. But I want to tie us to the Tulsa Massacre because we are, the centennial is this week, and I would love to just hear you talk a little bit about how Black migration to Oklahoma connects to the Tulsa Massacre.
Yeah, so with the anniversary, I feel like I've been like screaming it everywhere I can, hoping that this narrative is kind of changing, and I think it has a little with the centennial, but understanding that African Americans came to Tulsa, were interested in Tulsa and the broader Oklahoma region because of this Black Native history and because of this existence of Black people owned by Native Americans, I think is really key to understanding the foundation of the wealth that created Black Wall Street, and also just kind of the existence of not just Black entrepreneurship, but also Black community building. And so many of the Black towns that exist in Oklahoma were created by people who had land allotments through the Dawes process. And so those people, kind of came together with African Americans from the US, and they formed towns like Boley, Oklahoma, which started with the land allotment of a Creek freed girl. And so the African Americans who come to Indian Territory are already expecting a different experience because they know that there are opportunities, that there is a different kind of landscape because of tribal sovereignty, because these Black people do have the right still to vote, still to serve on juries, going up to statehood in 1907. When in the United States, much of that has kind of been unfortunately rewound by white terrorism and white violence. A lot of the Black politicians in office have been taken out, but there are still Black people in tribal councils in Indian Territory. And so they see this difference. And this is why migration there is really so important at the turn of the century, really such a large kind of population. And that is why the Greenwood District is a mixture of Black and Black Native people, who some of whom use wealth from their land allotments, sometimes oil and gas wealth, but also just the ability to farm, get education, things like that. And they really create that community that we now think of as Black Wall Street.
Thank you. So we have, like I said, we have a number of questions in the chat here. I'm going to try to get to as many as I can. So we have a couple of questions about gender, and so I'll start there. One person asks, can you talk about the role, if at all, gender played when the US forced Indigenous tribes to grant their former slaves citizenship and land? Did women have access to that land? And then I wonder if another person is asking if you can talk a little bit about the role that Native women or perhaps Black women played in marriages between Native and Black people during this period. So just thinking about sort of how gender played a role as these allotments were playing out.
Well, there has been a lot of great writing on the Dawes allotment process as it relates to Native women. Let's see if I can remember the names right now. Rose Strimlaw has a great book on that. With freed people families, everyone gets an allotment. So women do get an allotment, men get an allotment, children get an allotment. Sometimes, or actually perhaps often, these land allotments are not next to each other. And so there are decisions to be made about, which land allotment are we going to live on? Are we going to sell the others? Are we going to use those for farmland, et cetera? I know usually the man's allotment was chosen more often, but there are kind of various ways that land allotments are better or worse. Like sometimes there's timber on it, sometimes it looks barren, but there's oil underneath. As far as intermarriage, there are relatively small amounts of intermarriage, especially in the Chickasaw and Choctaw nations. There are people like Buck Colbert Franklin, who's the father of historian John Hope Franklin, who talks about his grandmother being Choctaw. There are kind of stories of this intermarriage, but when it comes down to it, there is relatively little of that depending on the nation. So the Creek and Seminole nations I know have more, but there is always this kind of fear of miscegenation, that intermarriage and interracial sex is going to create people who are viewed as Black and not as Native. And so you see that in a lot of the legislation in all of these tribes, forbidding interracial sex, forbidding interracial marriage, forbidding citizenship for interracial children. And Ty Miles' first book, Ties That Bind, talks about that, how it was difficult to have an interracial marriage or an interracial sexual relationship that produces children, and how those mixed race children were treated differently depending on how the nation was thinking about citizenship and thinking about kinship and belonging at that time.
Thank you. Yeah, those two books by Rose Tremlow and Taya Miles are great. I definitely recommend them for anybody who's interested in this topic and learning more. So this is a question that I think, again, ties to discussions that, everybody's sort of having right now. Not everybody, but lots of people are having within society right now. This person says, thank you so much for your insightful discussion. My question is about reparations. Increasingly, discussion of reparations are gaining traction, particularly across academic institutions that benefited from and were built with slave labor. Are there discussions about what reparations for descendants of slaves and freed people of the 5 tribes may look like, if at all?
I was just having this conversation on Twitter today. So in my book, I loosely call the land allotments that freed people receive as reparations. And I do that because the white Americans who are orchestrating this allotment are doing it definitely to create native dispossession, to, as I said, kind of get a foothold in tearing apart Native nations and making it part of the United States. But also, a lot of these men are Republicans who think about land ownership as something that will allow Black people to kind of create their own communities, to build themselves up after slavery. And so, this is usually in paternalistic words and thinking, but I feel like it is really with the intent to make a difference in these Black people's lives, even if they're not at all willing to do that in the United States. And so I do think of that land allotment as something that did economically and socially change the lives of those freed people. And the economist Melinda Miller has done work that shows that Cherokee freed people did have better education, better wealth accumulation and retention as a result of these land allotments. And so even though it doesn't come with like an apology from these Indian nations, and technically it really didn't come willingly from these Indian nations, it still is something I think that is, given with the desire to make a difference, and does make a difference. And it would have continued to create generational wealth if not for something like Black Wall Street, the destruction in the Tulsa Massacre. And so, of course, the conversation about the Tulsa Massacre and reparations for that is ongoing. And it's really one of the clearest examples of Black wealth that has been, purposely destroyed. There are plenty of records that show exactly what people lost. One of the survivors who spoke to Congress spoke about how her life changed, her economic circumstances changed after the massacre, and yet there's kind of still no ability or desire to end that conversation by saying, yes, we owe you something, not just an apology, but also, financially. So the reparations discussion, I think, is interesting in Indian territory because I feel like it did kind of happen, and that Reconstruction was used as almost sort of an experiment in land possession for Black people. But also, it's just kind of an example of how racism in the United States works, and that it builds on itself. And so even if you get out after slavery, well, maybe everything you had just blew up because of racist white people in the Tulsa Massacre. And now what do? Now you have to start over again. And, even if you do that, well, what's going to happen when redlining comes, or what's going to happen when such and such comes? And, it's almost impossible to escape unscathed. So yeah, basically, I think Oklahoma is a great study on reparations and the real need for it.
Thanks. That sort of ties to another question that we got in the chat about sort of the aftermath of these allotments. So, after Indian free people were given these allotments, were they able to maintain that land? As you've talked about, there are multiple other barriers that come up. Are there Black landowners today who can trace their allotments in Oklahoma back to that 1866 treaty? And just kind of want to hear about what the aftermath of that is.
Yeah, my family still has their land allotment. There is at least one that is still there, and it's kind of funny to see the deed because now it's, I don't even know, 30 people, 40 people, because it just, every generation there are more and more owners almost. But yeah, there are many families like that in Oklahoma, but unfortunately there were kind of guards put in place to protect Native and freed people by, not having them pay taxes, and also kind of racist / paternalistic, but not allowing some Native people to sell their land allotments, which was on one hand kind of beneficial and on the other hand harmful, because some of them needed that land or needed that money to eat or to buy things. And eventually, a few years out from the end of allotment, those restrictions are taken off. Many Native and Black people don't realize those restrictions are taken off, and they don't pay taxes, and they lose their land that way. Sometimes there are people who are just kind of schemers and cheaters who steal their land away through various means. Like, many of these people are still illiterate, especially the older generations. And so unfortunately, sometimes they sign things and their land is gone. But there are also people like Sarah Rector, who maybe some people know, who at one point was the richest Black girl, actually, I think richest girl in general, maybe in the United States, who was a freed person descendant, and who was able to keep all of the wealth from her land. And that came from oil and natural gas through a guardian appointed by the United States. And so there are certainly success stories, like on a very high level. There are kind of middling success stories, like my family. We never got any money from the land allotment, but it's still very sentimentally important, I think, that we still have that land in our family. And then there are many more people who don't have that land anymore for various reasons, most of which were out of their control.
Thank you. We have a couple of different questions about the differences between some of the tribes that held slaves. So I'll say that generally, and then I'll sort of follow up with some of the specific things folks are asking. So one person asks that, following up on what you talked about with the Treaty of 1866, some tribes resisted, such as the Chickasaw, resisted adoption more successfully. Can you talk a little bit more about the differences between these tribes in terms of their relationships with freed people? And specifically, how do you understand those differences in ways that might challenge existing scholarship on this topic?
I'm not sure I understand the differences between the 5 tribes in ways that challenge the existing scholarship. There hasn't been that much work done on the Chickasaws and more on the Choctaws, but still not as much as, say, the Cherokees or even the Creeks. Generally, the Chickasaws and Choctaws are known for really disliking Black people. I mean, the historical sources say that. Tribal agents, white men who come into these nations often say that they're kind of surprised at how badly Black people are treated, or how badly Chickasaw and Choctaw Indians think about Black people. Not to say it's, like a racial utopia in the other nations, but they do kind of, in a better way and a quicker way, come around in the Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole nations to adoption and to allowing Black people and Black Indians to take on leadership roles or to play parts in government. Whereas in, as you mentioned, in the Chickasaw Nation, free people are never adopted. And so there is nothing we can even point to say, at one time we were adopted and now we're disenfranchised. It's just, they signed a treaty and they never followed through on those terms. The Choctaws did at a later date, but because the Chickasaw and Choctaw treaties were tied together, it didn't necessarily come to the end that the treaty was supposed to come to. Okay, how can I explain that? So the Choctaws and Chickasaws have an interesting treaty because the United States says, you can adopt these people, these freed people, or you cannot adopt them, but if you don't adopt them, you're not going to get the money for the land that we've just taken from you, bought from you. And so it's an interesting choice given to them. And I've always kind of searched for documents on why they were given this specific choice. I haven't found them, maybe someone else will. But I just kind of have to draw the conclusion that this prejudice among these two nations was known, and they thought, well, you know, they're not going to adopt them, then we'll get to keep that money. It's really great. And there have been lawsuits back and forth between the two nations and the United States over that money and over that difference in those treaties. But that is the biggest difference. There are other differences in how much land is given to freed people in all of the treaties. The Choctaw and Chickasaw Nation Treaty is also the only treaty not to have what you call a guilt clause. So they don't admit any guilt for kind of allying themselves with the Confederacy, whereas the other nations do that in their treaties. And so it's another part of the difference in the Choctaws and Chickasaws deciding to educate their children and deciding that it's really important for them to know about the United States. So that kind of strategic choice that they made to buy into certain American things that ended up helping them out in multiple ways.
Thank you. We have a couple of other questions just about sort of the aftermath of, you know, once these different tribes are required to extend citizenship and land to Indian freed people. One is a question about boarding schools. Did Indian freed people during the allotment period, were they ever forced to go to boarding schools in the same way that Native children were during this period? I know we talked about that just briefly before. And then this is another question about, you know, of course, after this period, you know, you have the Dawes rules and lots of ways that the United States government serves trying to make sense of these populations of people. And so one person is asking if there was pressure from Indian freed people to identify as either Black or Native on the census. And if that was a choice that people were able to make personally or one that was sort of forced upon them.
Well, so there was a Twitter account. It's called Choctaw Freedmen. That it's run by two, I believe they're undergrads at Columbia, and they're also freedmen descendants. And they have like a wealth of information, and they've actually introduced me to things that I didn't know. And so they were talking about a boarding school the other day where freed people went. Now, I had never found anything in my sources that talked about freed people being forced to go to boarding schools. But there are many schools where Black and Native people, not necessarily Black Native people, but African Americans and Native people came into contact, like the Choctaw Academy, which Christina Snyder has written a book about. And there are also places like Hampton and Black schools where Native students went, either voluntarily or forcibly. And so those are examples of Black and Native people, again, being kind of pushed into this subservient role, because these are schools where they're supposed to learn how to basically be a second-class citizen. And there are lots of interesting examples about how there's camaraderie and alliance at these schools, but also racism and prejudice against each other. Your second question, so until, gosh, what is it, 1960, I think, you didn't get to choose your own race on the census. So a census taker, usually a white person, would come to your door and, you know, decide what race you are based on how you looked, sometimes based on who was in your household and how they looked. So my family actually, on one census, we are Native, an earlier census, and on the next census, we're Black. You know, is that because someone else came to the door the next time? There are multiple reasons why. But it actually creates kind of an issue for historians and for people doing genealogical work, because it can be hard to trace your family and to, you know, kind of see if you're trying to find out, you know, was my family Native, or, you know, how do they racially identify, because races change all the time from census to census. Now, after the census, I know that it was kind of a really big thing when people could check multiple boxes. I think that was only maybe the last census. No, the last census, like 2 censuses ago, that you could be multiracial suddenly. And I know that was kind of really great for Black Native people who were able to finally have their full identity, as well as a lot of other mixed race people.
Thanks. And that ties really well. We have time for about one more question, and we have a couple of questions in here about your research methodology and a couple of people who are interested in researching their own family history. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about some of the challenges that you faced in archives, in oral tradition, thinking about methodologies in the field, and just bringing some of these unheard voices to the forefront. How that worked in your own research, and any advice that you have for others who are interested in exploring their own family histories that are tied to this past.
My first word of advice is the minute you start thinking about it, start talking to people, especially your elders. I waited too long and many of my elders had passed on, which is something I will always regret. I did get to interview some of them because I knew that it would be important to me to have my family in my book, which they are. But also, while oral histories and kind of family narratives are important, you want to make sure that they are interspersed with like archival sources and things that you can also kind of point to say, look, like this was a pattern. It didn't just happen with my family, or perhaps like it happened with all these other people and it happened differently to my family. And so this kind of shows something else about history and how certain processes happen. So for example, my second cousin, who was one of my big kind of treasure troves, told me about a story of my great-great-great-grandfather being told by his former owner that he could ride on a horse, and as long as he could ride that horse in a day, he could live on that land. And he did it. He had a very big piece of land until land allotment broke that up. And I was like, well, okay, I mean, that sounds really cool, but it also sounds like something that would be in like a TV show. And then I found it 2 other times in the archive, people saying similar things. And, I mean, okay, it's due to other times, but still, it means that it's not just kind of an exaggeration or a fabrication, right? It means that, okay, it happened a few times. Maybe it was rare, but it still shows this sort of relationship between Black and Native people in a certain way after the Civil War. And so gather as much information as you can. Use things like the Dawes rolls, as well as the Dawes testimony that is on places like Ancestry.com. And then, use genealogical resources. Afrogenius, the Black Native Forum on Afrogenius, run by Angela Walton Raji, was amazing. I went there as a college student just being like, can you guys help me? Like, I think this person is my relative, and they were amazing. So the community is certainly there and they are ready and willing to help you. It's just, come in and be humble, because I think we all want to kind of find these really interesting parts of our family history, but don't come in wanting to find a certain thing, because that can lead to heartbreak sometimes.
Thank you. I think that's good advice. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Roberts. This was a wonderful conversation, and I really appreciate you sharing your knowledge with us. And thank you to everybody in the audience for joining us today. A recording of this program will be available on the Newberry's YouTube channel in a few days. And I also want to encourage everyone to read Dr. Roberts's book, I've Been Here All the While, Black Freedom on Native Land, which you can purchase through the Newberry Library's Rosenberg Bookshop online. And we would certainly appreciate your support on that. Newberry programs remain free and open to the public, thanks to the generosity of our donors. During this critical time, we need the support of our entire community. So I'll, want to encourage you to please continue to support the library by making a gift today. And you can do so at newberry.org/give. We look forward to welcoming visitors back to our events at the Newberry as soon as it's safe to do so in person. But in the meantime, we'd like to invite you to join us for our next virtual program, America's First Civil Rights Movement, with Kate Masur and Kianga Yamada Taylor on Thursday, June 10th, 2021 from 4 to 5 p.m. Central Time. In that program, Dr. Kate Masur will discuss her new book, Until Justice Be Done, America's First Civil Rights Movement from the Revolution to Reconstruction, with Dr. Kianga Taylor. Until Justice Be Done reconsiders the history of the nation's earliest federal civil rights measures, the 14th Amendment and the Civil Rights Act of 1856. You can register for this and other programs on our website, newberry.org. And thank you all again for coming and for tuning in for today. Have a great rest of your evening.